Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about global disaster response and recovery analysis. And this is the timeline for our presentation. First, we will talk about problem statement to explain why this topic is important. Then we're going to talk about data set description. Based on data set description, we will have some research questions. This is our direction of where we dig in. And based on these research questions, we will have visualizations. Then we'll have limitations that we faced during the process. And last is a conclusion. This is a problem statement. As natural disasters become more frequent in today's world, emergent systems face unprecedented challenges. Response efficiency is crucial to minimizing loss of life, reducing economic damage, and ensuring timely social recovery. This project leveraged global disaster response data to identify critical response gaps and inform more effective, data-driven disaster preparedness and planning. And here is our dataset description. This dataset contains the basic information of the global disaster that occurred during the year from 2018 and 2024. And below is the first couple rows of our data. And here is our data description, the name of each of the variable and the description of each data and their data type. And here are the research questions. And this is the direction where we dig into. Which type of the disaster is most severe? How does the distribution of disaster differ between different country and region? Is emergency response efficient? And does response efficiency impact the time needed for social recovery?
So, if we look at disaster frequency, first, as the pie chart shows, disaster are relatively evenly distributed across types. No single disaster type clearly dominates in terms of frequency, which suggests that exposure is fairly balanced. However, frequency alone does not explain the overall risk and the whole pattern. So when you look at severity, tornadoes and volcanic eruptions shows slightly higher average severity scores, but the differences across disaster types are moderate. When we consider impact, different patterns emerge. Landslides and earthquakes result in higher human casualties, while volcanic eruptions and landslides are associated with greater economic losses. So, like different disaster types exhibit distinct risk profiles. Some are economically destructive, others are humanly devastating. And next, I'll move to part two, the spatial analysis of disaster distribution. So here, the screenshot of the dashboard shows the global distribution of disasters by country. We can see that disaster occurrences are unevenly distributed geographically, with some countries experiencing consistently higher frequencies than others. And to make this more concrete, the bar chart compares disaster counts across countries. More importantly, when we interact with the map, I mean the dashboard, and select a specific country, for example, here I paste the screenshot of me selecting Brazil. The disaster type breakdown changes noticeably. Here I select Brazil, and in the chart below, we could see like how many disasters of each type appear in Brazil in the form below, and we can see the count of the total disasters on the right of the map. and like we can do this for all the countries here. And overall, this shows that understanding disaster risk requires looking beyond frequency alone and considering where disasters occur and what types of disasters dominate in each region.
In this visualization illustrates the relationship between response efficiency, recovery time, and disaster severity across multiple countries and regions. In the upper chart, we observe a clear positive correlation. Higher disaster severity is associated with relative higher response efficiency, but also typically longer recovery times. This suggests that while emergency service responds quickly to severe disasters, the extent of the damage necessitates a longer recovery period. The color gradients further reinforce this pattern, with more severe event clustered in the upper right corner and represented by warmer colors. In contrast, the lower chart shows a significant negative correlation between response efficiency and response time, indicating that higher efficiency scores are consistently associated with faster emergency response times measured in hours. In summary, these charts highlighted that while efficient response system can significantly shorten intermediate response time, long-term recovery outcomes remain largely depend on the severity of the disaster itself.
Okay, now I'll move on to part four, the continental analysis. In this section, we shift our focus from individual disasters to a broader continental perspective, looking at disaster severity, frequency, and response efficiency. Let's start with this continental severity index heat map. On the horizon axis, we have different disaster types, and on the vertical axis, countries grouped by continent. The color intensity represents the average severity index. One key takeaway here is that average disaster severity is relatively similar across continents. Most values fall within a narrow range, roughly between 4.8 and 5.3. This suggests that globally, disasters tend to have comparable levels of severity. However, what differs significantly is the composition of risk. Different countries experience different types of severe disasters. For example, Asia tends to show higher severity in flood and extreme heat, while Europe appears more affected by wildfires and volcanic related events. So instead of one continent being universally more severe, this shows that each continent faces a distinct disaster profile, which is important context when we later evaluate response efficiency. Next, we look at the global distribution of disasters using this map. This visualization highlights how disasters are spread geographically and how frequently they occur across continents. We can clearly see that continents like Asia and North America experience disasters very frequently, often across multiple disasters types. This repeated exposure suggests that these regions may have accumulated more experience in disaster response and emergency management. In contrast, regions such as Oceania or South Africa tend to experience disasters that are more concentrated in certain types rather than across the entire spectrum. This natural this naturally leads to an important analytical question. If a continent faces disasters more frequently, does that mean it becomes more efficient at responding to them? On this slide, we directly examine the relationship between disaster severity, disaster frequency, and response efficiency. Starting with the scatter plot at the top, we compare average disaster severity with average response efficiency. What we observe is that there is no strong negative relationship between the two. Higher disaster severity does not automatically result in lower response efficiency. Some continents are able to maintain relatively high efficiency even when facing more severe disasters. The bottom chart further explores whether continents with frequent disasters tend to have higher response efficiency. If we only compare averages, Differences across continents appear quite small. However, when we look at the full distribution, we notice that some continents show more stable and consistent response performance, while others experience large variability, including cases of very low efficiency. This suggests that disaster frequency or severity alone does not determine response efficiency. Other structural factors are likely playing a much larger role. Before concluding, I'd like to briefly acknowledge a few limitations of our analysis. First, we did not account for political or policy-related factors, such as governance, quality, or emergency management systems, which could influence response efficiency. And second, our dataset includes a limited set of countries, meaning some continents may not be fully representative. Finally, we lack detailed information on technological development and infrastructure, which are likely critical component of effective disasters response. Okay, so in conclusion, this project provides a comprehensive data-driven overview of global disasters response and recovery patterns from 2018 to 2024. Through multiple layered visualization analysis, we find significant differences across countries and continents in terms of disaster severity and geographical distribution, response efficiency, and recovery outcomes. The findings suggest that the higher response efficiency is closely linked to faster emergency response times, underscoring the importance of preparedness and operational effectiveness. However, the time required for recovery is still significantly influenced by disaster severity and regional capacity, suggesting that efficient response measures alone are insufficient for rapid society recovery. Despite limitations in sample coverage, policy factors, and technological differences, the analysis demonstrate that data visualization can help us better understand global disaster risk and inform the development of more targeted and equitable disasters management strategies. Thank you. Thank you.
棒棒。